This lecture is for students who have had instruction and experience in documenting their sources, but remain frustrated or bewildered by what it's all about. We're going to talk about the tradition of documenting sources in Western academia, the chain of sources, and research dialogue, critical reflection, voice, and commentary. We're going to look at the distinction between paraphrase and quotation, and review your documentation responsibilities. Of course, by now, you've probably completed many writing assignments using research and documenting it, but many people find that they continue to face challenges. For example, how exactly do I quote and paraphrase effectively? How do I deal with those exasperating citation formats? What happens if I consistently have teachers say to me, you're struggling with plagiarism? Then there's a more profound challenge. Because when we document sources, we're really talking about a dialogue, balancing one's voice with the voices of your sources. And this requires a critical interaction with source materials. If you have felt frustrated because you really don't understand what the whole matter of documenting sources is about, then it will help if you start to understand the tradition of Western scholarly academics. There are core values which are shared by scholars in that tradition, and they have to do with documentation formats, yes, with intellectual property, yes, and these are focuses of great vigilance. You've probably had professors that really care about these things. But there's a deeper value which is served by these concerns, and that is the importance of critical dialogue, individual scholars like you working critically within the scholarly tradition. You may find it helpful to visualize the long trail of learning going back at least 4,000 years. How does scholarship work? How does it advance? Well, it does so with something that people call dialectic. That is, learning is preserved in the literature, and then scholars read that literature, but they critically interact with it. They recognize what has been established, but they also look for weaknesses and blind spots. And this leads to new work which advances from both of those. This is how scholarship works, and that's why scholars in this tradition are expected to critically interact with sources and to leave a clearly marked trail of references. Who said what? And if I want to, how can I follow up and read the source? Let's acknowledge at this point that there are other scholarly traditions. They also reverence their tradition of learning, but they do it differently, reflecting their cultural traits, which might include high context communication habits, a high power distance between authorities and less authoritative people, a collectivist or long-term orientation. Well, these traits affect the way sources are documented. There's quotation, yes, but little discussion and maybe not any citations. A reader, if he or she is educated, is expected to recognize classic texts when he or she sees them. At present, however, you're working within the Western academic tradition, and that means that there are certain expectations of your writing. You are expected to make detailed references to scholarly literature. You are expected to discuss those texts critically, in your voice, offering some form of original contribution to the dialogue. And you're expected to explicitly indicate what those sources are, leaving a sort of trail of breadcrumbs, which provides a map for your reader to look up the original sources. Now, the first fretful thought that comes into many students' minds when I say documenting sources is the whole business of tricky citation formats. But there's a step in order to be successful that comes well before that, and many college students are not aware of this. You have to have something to say about your sources. If you don't have anything to say about your sources, you're not going to succeed even if you get the formats correctly. So you need to read carefully and critically and think about what you read. What is established? What is left unverified or undiscovered? What is significant about the material? Does it compare to something? Are there implications? Is there an argument to look at? What's the evidence, etc., etc.? Where should research lead next? You should be thinking these kinds of questions about your sources before you even try to write. In this context, we can understand the two things that you're expected to do when writing about your research. They're opposite, and yet they complement each other. First, your readers, your teachers, will expect you to reflect critically in your voice. They really want that. They also want references to source materials, maybe offering evidence or contrasts or all kinds of possibilities. Well, which of these two things is more important? Well, that's a ridiculous question. Both are crucial. You need balance in your writing between the two of them. There are two kinds of problem that students have. On the one hand, they write freely in their own thoughts without any evidence or documentation, just kind of free-flowing. On the other hand, they might present a lot of quotation without themselves saying anything substantive. Both of these are problems. These principles will give you a standpoint from which to assess your research writing. In it, do you typically reflect critically on topics and sources? Do you offer abundant support for your comments with evidence and source references? Do you document your sources so readers always know who says what and where the originals can be found? Now, some students, perhaps students from a different cultural tradition, might be made uncomfortable by these expectations. They might feel that they're being asked to be rude, to critique the work of experts, to offer their own ideas, to flag references to iconic sources readers should know about. It may be that your writing roots are influencing you, and there is absolutely no reason to question the legitimacy of those roots. However, working in Western scholarly communities, you do need to code switch. And you need to understand that Western scholars do not respect writing that doesn't contribute critical reflection. And they expect you to mark the boundaries between your voice and that of your sources. And they demand explicit citations to lead them to original sources. Okay, given all that, let's say you want to refer to some material in another source. Well, you have three options to do this, and all three can be legitimate. First, you can paraphrase, that is, restate the material drawing from a source, but using your own fresh language. Second, you can summarize it, which is the same thing, but it reduces the complexity of the material. Third, you can use the wording of the original. That, of course, is called quotation. Let's look at the first option, paraphrase. That is, sharing detailed source material, but using your own words. Let's take a very famous sentence, the first sentence of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now, here's a paraphrase. In the first sentence of her iconic novel, Austen ironically reflects her society's universal assumption that a wife will form an important but subordinate component of a wealthy man's estate. Now you see, that characterizes what's in that sentence in completely different words, and nowhere near as charming words at that. Here's a summary. Austen's novel, as a whole, deftly and acerbically dissects the illusions and follies of two essentially worthy but proud and chauvinistic people. Now, paraphrase has a particular power, and this is why scholars, experienced scholars, generally present things in the form of paraphrase. By paraphrasing, you can present source material in your own words and reflecting your critical thinking. As we look at this paraphrase, notice the critical reflection that's already in it. There's interpretation, there's social commentary, there's evaluation of the novel as iconic, etc. The scholarly convention is to paraphrase much and quote little. Many students do the opposite. You can maintain the presence of your voice even when sharing source material by using paraphrase. In a quotation, of course, you transcribe the source words directly. And this has value. First of all, it has credibility. This is what the source really said. Secondly, quotations are chosen because the wording is so great. No paraphrase can improve on that first sentence in Austen's novel. The dangers of quotation are that while you're quoting, your voice falls silent, and if you do it too much, your reader is very unimpressed with what you're contributing. Sometimes students will submit a paper which has a scattergun list of quotations which don't seem to mean anything or have any connection. Or you can have dangling quotations. There's a quotation there, but nothing introduces it or comments on it, and the quotation is left to speak for itself without any framing. And then there's one more danger of quotation. Unacknowledged quotations. That is language which comes from a source you're referring to, but you don't mark it as a quotation. Quotations must be acknowledged in the Western tradition. You do this through quotation marks or block quotation format, and Harvey explains this on page 91. These boundaries distinguish between voices so we know who's speaking. If there are no quotation marks, you may not realize it, but you're making a claim. You're saying the language in this passage is mine. If it isn't, in Western scholarship, that's plagiarism. Whenever you refer to material from a source, you incur two kinds of debt. First, concerning the ideas and the information that you're borrowing. Second, there's a question of the language of expression. In a quotation, you owe credit for both of these things. In a paraphrase or summary, you probably are not indebted for the language, but you are indebted for the ideas and information. And then, of course, you must acknowledge any quoted language that creeps into the paraphrase. Hopefully, at this point, we can understand three responsibilities that you always have when you refer to materials from a source. Always document your references for your reader. First, attribute any reference to another source. Second, indicate borrowed language with quotation marks or block quotation. Third, cite the source in two places. According to APA, that includes the in-text citation and the reference list. Now, we just used a term that you may or may not be familiar with, attribution. Attribution consists of phrases that signal the source of the material. This is common in everyday speech. I say, last night Bill told me to see the movie. That's paraphrased, by the way, but that material Bill told me, that tells you who said it. Or, last night Bill said, see this movie, quotation. This is a crucial scholarly habit, but one that students often don't remember to follow. Always introduce a reference. Clue the reader in on how to take the material. For example, suppose I start a reference, a paraphrase, or a quotation like this. One economist makes the mistake of assuming that, okay, whatever this is, you know as a reader that I am asking you to see this material as a mistake. Okay, let's put it all together. This is how scholars operate in referring to other sources. First, they use the last name of the author. They generally paraphrase but blend in brief quotations. So they do something like this. Austen's famous irony kicks the novel off with an apparently, quote, universally acknowledged, end of quote, truth, equating a wife's value with, quote, possession of a good fortune. But wait a minute, what's missing there? The citation. That is, the specific link to the scholarly literature, so your reader can look things up. Now, the two most common scholarly formats in the academic world are APA and MLA, and both of them have two halves to the citation. First, they both do in-text citation, which includes attribution and, if necessary, quotation marks, and a parenthetical link to the list of sources. Full bibliographical information on each cited source located on the final report pages. We're going to look more at this material in the next recorded lectures. Now, you may say, well, wait a minute, what about that thing, plagiarism? Well, plagiarism is often an issue. Plagiarism consists of paraphrasing or quoting sources without citations, or quoting without quotation marks. This is a violation of intellectual property, but far more important, it breaks the chain of research. It doesn't distinguish the writer's voice from the voice of the sources, and it doesn't provide information on where to find sources. Hopefully, this material will help you understand why you're being asked to use these very complicated documentation formats. Do it. Be a scholar. Read and reflect critically on your sources before you refer to them. If you don't do that, you really have nothing to offer. Select key materials. Have something to say about those key materials. And blend brief quotations into paraphrases, attributing references, and citing the original sources.